Hello, my name is Louis Henderson. I'm a filmmaker. And today I'm going to be speaking about my work as a filmmaker, but I'm not really going to be focusing so specifically on examples of films, but actually speaking more generally about certain sort of conceptual underpinnings and my approach to making work. So I change and I exchange. This is a line from a book by Edouard Glissant called Poetics of Relation, and I'm going to be drawing heavily on this book today as a way to inquire into questions to do with legitimacy, identity, and comprehension within my work as a filmmaker. As a filmmaker with an interest in the documentary as a genre of fiction, the powers of the false inherent in the cinematic image, and the possibility for films to critically inquire into the ethnographic and the anthropologic, these are, of course, very important questions to be approached. Furthermore, as a white, northern European male who has made works in countries and cultures other than his own, to face questions of legitimacy, for example, is vitally important, so they should be considered. However, I was particularly interested in this today because of the title of this section, Art and Its New Identities. I'm interested to try and think through some new and potentially problematic propositions today in relation to questions of legitimacy and identity, but to try and look at the sort of the kind of restrictive and counterproductive nature of much criticism that has nonetheless perhaps justifiably been positioned towards my work. I'm aware this is a deeply tricky subject to approach, as obviously it would be the white European male that would be arguing against claims of legitimacy, as I'm almost always legitimized to speak anywhere I go. So of course, from this position of privilege, I'm able to speak critically of such arguments. Yet I'm not trying to undo the importance of this questioning. I'm in no way trying to undermine the relevance of posing such questions, but I'm just keen to try and find new ways to approach these problems that are inherent in my work and the questioning of it. So in regard to legitimacy, often it's said that I have no right to speak of a culture that I have no direct cultural ties to, that I have no right to speak of a place in which I have no roots, within which I have no origins, that the approach I've made with my work in fact repeats colonial systems of domination and oppression by the very fact that I travel somewhere that's other than my own and try to work with the people and surroundings that I find myself in. That really I should be from a place in order to know how to speak of it, or even to know how to speak or where to speak from in the first place. So what this means is that I should clearly understand a place in order to make it work. I must be able to grasp what is unique to this place, and to do this I must be intimately included within that culture to understand its hidden secrets. Otherwise, I would not be able to represent it or be represented through it. What must be upheld in these instances, according to certain critics, is a form of understanding that's legitimated through transparency and knowledge. So I find these criticisms quite problematic because of the way in which they treat difference, knowledge, territory, for example, and for the fact that if I reverse the argument outwards from my own locus, from myself, it would sound to me that this is very similar to the racist and nationalistic rhetoric that is currently rearing its ugly head within that strange little collection of countries which we call the United Kingdom, especially the new Prime Minister in regard to her recent speech on immigration at the Conservative Party conference, which was interestingly compared to Hitler's Mein Kampf and then later compared to Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, two very famous examples of far-right fascist anti-immigration nationalisms. So in response to this, I thought it was interesting to perhaps come back to reading Glissant again, and decided to reconsider these arguments of legitimacy into what Glissant terms a filial tie to culture. So the word filial relates to being a son or a daughter, and thus indicates a certain paternal relationship to a land or a community, based on being rooted and having an originary belonging within said land or culture. And this filial relationship to earth is used to legitimize the seizure of land as territory, the enclosing of land into a specific space that belongs to some and not to others. The filial community and its territory are defined precisely by who and what they exclude. And the filial community excludes anyone that does not participate in this paternal rooting. So this is according to Glissant from his book, Poetics of Relation. And for him, this is the foundation of Western communities, and which led to the project of territorial expansion and cultural domination through colonization. So filial cultures, these cultures obsessed with this paternal relationship, cannot accept difference because it poses a threat to their existence as a specific culture with a rooted identity. This is what Glissant calls the threat of illegitimacy. And he talks about this as the threat of the illegitimate child, a child that would ruin the bloodline through forms of interracial mixing. And just as an aside, one of the ways in which Glissant has addressed that is by looking into the literature of William Faulkner, for example, and the ways in which he deals with questions to do with racial intermixing within the southern states of the United States of America. So anyway, as a kind of moral and ethical obligation, this filial culture tries to understand difference. And this form of understanding, which I'll speak a bit about now, is a kind of understanding that underpins Western ethnography and carries within it a form of violence. Because understanding, in the way that Glissant proposes it in his book, can be seen as a kind of capture, grasping an idea, for example, and forces difference to reveal itself as something that has to be comprehended. Now, this verb comprehend is actually what Glissant uses in the book. He uses well, not comprehend, but he uses the French word comprendre, which comes from Latin comprehendere, which indicates notions of understanding, but also grasping, seizing, taking. So it's comprised of two words, com, with, and prehendere, which means literally to take. Like in French, comprendre, prendre means to take. So it's in this sense that to understand difference, to want to understand difference, to have knowledge of difference, is also to apprehend and to arrest it and to eventually assimilate it into a dominant culture as otherness, rendered transparent, rendered comprehensible. This is what Glissant calls the thought of the other. And I believe that this is the logic of domination and of capitalism, that to know is to take and thus to own. Furthermore, it's connected with an argument of having to have a legitimate right to speak of a place or culture based on a deeper understanding of that culture tied to a rooted identity with said culture, which I think for me restricts and closes down any chance of a confrontation with a potential synthesis of difference, what Glissant calls métissage, which in French means racial intermixing, but for Glissant it actually extends to an idea of a sort of relational practice that affirms multiplicity and diversity, and involves within it a transformative process of, and I quote Glissant, the mutual mutations of this play of relations. That's the end of the quote. And this idea of a mutual mutation is very interesting for me. So I was going to show you a little image, but I don't have it. But what Glissant uses to kind of sum up this position of this filial culture that has this sort of rooted identity. He calls it a root identity, and he lists a few things. I'm not going to read them all out. I'll just read out some that are important. So according to Glissant, the root identity is sanctified by a hidden violence of filiation. It's ratified by a claim to legitimacy that allows a community to proclaim its entitlement to the possession of land, which thus becomes territory. The root identity is preserved by being projected onto other territories, and that makes their conquest legitimate. And then he ends saying, root identity, and therefore the thought of the self and of territory, and set in motion the thought of the other and of voyage. So the next part of the talk today, I take a line from a poet called Rimbaud, a French poet. Very famous line, everybody knows, I think, most people know. Je est un autre. I is another. So I use this to speak about a film that I made in Ghana in 2013 called Lettres du Voyant. This film is, it was an attempt at a kind of anti-ethnographic gesture, or more specifically, a critical inquiry into the images and forms of narration in the ethnographic cinema of Jean Rouch. In particular, in fact, Gilles Deleuze's reading of Jean Rouch's cinema and what he calls Rouch's desire to become other through his embodied camera ciné-trance. Rouch would create these kind of ciné-trances with his cameras. This is according to Deleuze, and he proposes the film as a famous film by Jean Rouch called Moi un noir, which literally translates as me, a black. And Deleuze thinks this film is Rouch actually trying to flee his own skin, his own dominative culture, to flee his whiteness, to become other through the forces of fiction. So I found this rather preposterous as a positioning from Deleuze, and perhaps from Rouch. I don't know if Rouch would ever have claimed exactly the same thing, but nonetheless I found it an interesting line of inquiry to follow. And in discussing this metamorphic transformation of Rouch through cinematic fiction or cinematic trance, Deleuze turns also to Arthur Rimbaud and his famously strange line, Je est un autre, I is another. With this sentence, Rimbaud indicates two coexisting sides to being by distancing the I from the first person, I is and not I am, and thus makes of it an object that exists within a body, that becomes other perhaps in the eye of someone else. Rimbaud writes this in his famous Lettres du Voyant from 1871, from which I take the film's title, in which he describes his desire to become a voyant, a seer, which is another way of saying a poet for Rimbaud, and in many ways relates perhaps to Pier Paolo Pasolini's Cinema of Poetry, which Pasolini described through the elaboration of a free, indirect, subjective style of writing certain images in cinema. Images that express a way of seeing, a point of view of a fictional character that is also kind of doubled up with the director's point of view and constructed through a mise en scène with a camera. What I think this comes down to is a way of thinking the possibility for a form of shared subjectivity that can oscillate and mutate between different states of being through coming into contact with difference. And then I just read a line from Rimbaud from the letters. He says, "It is wrong to say, I think. One ought to say, people think me. I is another." And actually, this is just a little aside that I added after listening to Paul's talk earlier and speaking about Stuart Hall, because it reminded me of the film Unfinished Conversation, which is a film that John Accompfra made about Stuart Hall. And there's a line, I just want to read a quick passage from Stuart Hall, and it makes me think of this line from Rimbaud. He says, "I don't think that identity is a kind of essence which exists inside all other things. I think that identity is always constructed in a conversation between who we are and the political ideologies out there. Although it feels as if it wells up from inside you by something which is absolutely yours, it's not really like that at all. It's the product of an endlessly ongoing conversation with everybody around you. You are partly how they see you." It's a bit like this thing from Rimbaud. One ought to say, people think me. Then I'm just going to show you a clip. It's the opening scene of this film, Lettres du Voyant.
what I know, and I will show you more. Mamenshema, let me see for you.
Okay, so that's the introductory scene. So this, I'll just quickly explain the film very briefly. It's a film that's told via a series of exchanges of letters, of emails between me and an email scammer from Ghana. And I was interested in the practice of email scamming in Ghana because very specifically there they have this practice called Sakawa. And Sakawa is actually where young email scammers, they use the powers of Ghanaian juju rituals to help them actually physically embody or spiritually embody the space of the internet, and they can travel through the Ethernet cables under the sea, and they can go to another country. They can go to Canada, for example, and try and convince somebody to send them money via the internet. And when I was researching about this, I read that a lot of these email scammers were making a sort of post-colonial argument for the reason why they were stealing. They said that they're trying to steal back some gold that was stolen from them during times of colonialism. And the film that I made then experiments with this form where the visions that we're supposed to be seeing have been filmed or seen by some other kind of spiritual being that might have embodied some kind of camera and that is giving the images back to me. So in Ghanaian animist practices, the Western notion of a dualism between subject and object is interestingly brought into question because subjectivity is actually present in all things. It exists in non-human and apparently inanimate things, such as trees and rocks and rivers. Subjectivity is outside. And I believe that this leads to a different reading of the dividing line between the self and the other, because it in turn suggests that the other is actually inside the self. It works back onto itself and claims the potential objectivity inherent in each subject. And then I just read another line from Glisson, because he talks about Rimbaud in the book. We know that the other is within us and affects how we evolve. Rimbaud, je et un autre, is a literal historical fact. I think it's in this sense, with this phrase, je et un autre, that perhaps Rimbaud signals the becoming of a poetics of relation. His poetic search was not merely a search for his own self, but a move towards a transformation of the self and a disruption of traditional notions of identity and territorialism through the way in which he conceived of the possibility of establishing a connection, a fundamental relation between the self and its own other. So it seems that subjectivity does not have to be something fixed or rooted within territorialized identities, but can be open and susceptible to change, created through the encounter with other subjectivities that experience a process of mutual mutation. I believe it's in this sense that the Brazilian psychoanalyst and writer Sueli Rolnik speaks of animist trance rituals as being what she calls contagious processes of collective assemblage in which a mutual subjectivation takes place. Perhaps that also could be the beginning of a sort of poetics of relation. So these are some ideas that I'm interested in experimenting with as a formal approach to filmmaking. How could a cinematic practice exalt a thought of errantry that links itself to the contradictory experience of contact amongst cultures? That's actually a line from Glisson too. He, in response to this idea of the root identity, he develops what he calls the relation identity. And he says the relation identity is not linked to a creation of the world, but to the conscious and contradictory experience of contact amongst cultures. So how can this cinematic practice work perhaps in a decolonizing sense through not creating merely this moral obligation of the thought of the other? Can we work towards cinematic practice that could perhaps inversely expound the other of thought? So that's quite a difficult thing to try and understand, what Glissant means by the other of thought, and he wrote a whole book about it. But to try and understand what the implications of this idea of the other of thought, I think it's better to quote, again, I should have said this at the beginning, that I quote heavily from people, and I will continue doing this. And even the end of my talk today is going to be sort of 2 pages from a book by a different author, which sort of relates to my film practice anyway, because the films I make are mostly made from sort of collaging material together, and also the practice borrowed from Benjamin of citing without quotation marks. So I'll just read this little section from Glissant. The thought of the other is sterile without the other of thought. Thought of the other is this moral generosity, disposing me to accept the principle of alterity, to conceive of the world as not as simple and straightforward, with only one truth, mine. But thought of the other can dwell within me without making me alter course, without prizing me open, without changing me within myself. The other of thought is precisely this altering. Then I have to act. That is the moment I change my thought without renouncing its contribution. I change and I exchange. So the other of thought is this potential transformation of each subject that can come about through the contradictory experience of contact amongst cultures. Yet, a very important thing that comes up for Glissant, already Paul spoke about this earlier, is this idea from him that is one has to respect within these moments the other's right to opacity, the right for somebody else not to have to reveal themselves, the right to hide their secrets, their singularity. And as such, we avoid the violent desire to assimilate difference by trying to understand what cannot be grasped, which cannot be, again, in this sense of comprendre. We can't grasp, we can't take it. So importantly for Glissant, this is a two-way process. Both cultures coming together must respect each other's differences as they exist precisely in difference. Yet, these opacities can coexist, they can converge and weave a social fabric together. And again, I quote from Glissant, this is a beautiful line, "To understand this truly, one must focus on the texture of the weave and not on the nature of its components." The weave, and that's the end of quote, the weave produces relation between differences, but it produces no boundaries between the opacities. We clamor for the right to opacity for everyone. That's one of Glissant's most famous formulas, and it's being repeated quite a lot at the moment by artists, but I think often it might be used in a rather contradictory manner in the sense that artists have used it to describe a desire in formal terms to resist communication of ideas through aesthetic experience. This is perhaps obscurity and not opacity, which is related, and I'll discuss obscurity a bit later and what obscurity as an aesthetic form can mean. So the right to opacity is not merely the right to be different, it's not the right to difference, it's the right not to be understood, precisely in these terms that I speak about understanding within the dichotomies of the relationship between, as Paul quite rightly said earlier, between dominating cultures and oppressed ones. The right to opacity then is essentially freedom and the assertion of agency within an exchange that could have an unfairly weighted action in terms of sort of power relationships. And I think that this relates interestingly to my film practice and the way that I think I have to perhaps try to continue making films. I don't think I've reached this yet. It's what I'm trying to think about now, today actually, with you. This is the first time I ever read this paper, and I'm thinking this while we're talking right now. But to try and think of a cinematic form that can perhaps resist this ethnographic tendency and the violence of explaining and understanding certain cultural customs. So I'm going to speak about obscurity and communication. And I'm not running massively over time, no. I won't go on for too long. But this is where it gets interesting, more interesting, because we're going to talk about Fred Moten, who, again, Paul spoke about earlier. So Fred Moten is an African-American poet, theorist, critic, and teacher. But I'm going to speak about not his books of theory. Well, you can't really make a difference, because his poetry is criticism as well, which is beautiful. But I'm going to talk about a book of poems he wrote called B. Jenkins. It's a really good book. And at the end of the book is an interview with him, which is such a good title for an interview, for a poet. The interview is called Words Don't Go There. So in this interview, Moten is asked about the fact that, because his poetry is pretty difficult to approach, and the interviewer says, you know, if we don't have the necessary background information that relates to the narratives, the situations, and the characters, there's a chance that much of the meaning in his poems will not be understood by the reader. Moten responds to this and says, well, this is a very difficult position, you know, as a poet, how to find the balance between the poetry he's trying to create and the desire or need for communication of ideas and images. Moten speaks of music and how music, nevertheless organized by well-defined and historically developed protocols, is not as constrained by the same requirement to meaning as written language, but yet it still carries content. Moten says that he's trying to write poems that can confront this musicality, and he asks, and I quote, "How is it that a work can bear content, have something to say, while not being wholly bound to the constraints and the requirements of making meaning?" I find that a wonderful idea to try and think in relationship to cinema too. So I think here we see a similar ethical positioning in relationship to this violence of comprehension, the right to opacity. And this for me poses an exciting path to think in respect to my own interest as a filmmaker, working with what can be called the documentary, which is an aesthetic form and genre that has been so tied for so long to this apparent requirement of making meaning. Again, I think this has important ethical and political position in response to works that deal with histories of colonialism and working in other cultures, or cultures other than our own. Moten almost reaches Glissant's formula in the interview, but through the voice of another author, already also mentioned today by Paul, called Saidiya Hartman, who he quotes, and I haven't actually read Hartman, but this is Moten quoting Hartman. He says, "The right to obscurity must be respected." But just before this, Moten says that he knows what he is writing is not for everyone, but he's trying to make it for everyone. And that this involves a certain sense of what he calls generosity. And I'll quote Moten again, and this is a great line. "Writing, reading, or teaching art is like passing the gift of some inexhaustible disruption from hand to hand. You mess with it and it messes with you. This form of generosity that is nevertheless involved with a need for a kind of anti-communication, an opaque aesthetic that resists the grasping of knowledge, reminds me very much of the formulation that Glissant offers in contrast to the verb comprendre. Glissant proposes donner avec. Two words, donner, to give, avec, with. But he uses a hyphen to join them together and makes it give with. In this instance, I believe this give with carries with it a sense of, in English, the verb to yield. I don't know if that makes sense to many people who aren't English natives, but to yield. To yield as in how a tree would yield fruit. A tree yields fruit, but a tree could also yield in the pressures of high wind. So it's to give, but also to give way. To bend and move in order to remain intact under pressure. And I think this notion of yielding is important when considering how to work in relation with someone else, in terms of how to collaborate and how to communicate with someone else. This generosity offered by yielding, by giving with, rather than grasping, is precisely this double action of resisting clear communication whilst at the same instance respecting someone's right to opacity. So now I will finally finish, but just with a few comments from where this all comes from and what this might mean for questions of legitimacy. In the interview, again, this interview from B. Jenkins, Moten claims that this idea of the hidden secret and this opacity that masks and camouflages are political imperatives that come essentially from African diasporic communities. And I quote Moten again, "Obscurity infuses the unfinished project of emancipation. It corresponds to the need for the fugitive, the immigrant, and the newly constrained citizen to hold something in reserve, to keep a secret. The history of Afro-diasporic art, especially music, is the history of the keeping of this secret even in the midst of its intensely public and highly commodified dissemination." We think of this at the moment with arguments around cultural appropriation, with hip-hop, with jazz, with lots of different music forms, for example. Thus, it might seem that what is being argued here from my position is a gross instance of badly misplaced cultural appropriation that has no legitimate right to be developed in such a manner as I'm attempting to do with you today, as I'm certainly not from this culture or history, even though in many ways I form part of it as a British citizen. The interviewer asks Moten about this very fact in reference to Alice Walker's famous short story called 1955, which is about cultural appropriation within rock and roll music in the 50s. And Moten responds in a very, because the interviewer says, "Oh, I see where you're going. You know, this is about white appropriation of black culture." And Moten says, "Yeah." And this is, I'm going to quote at length from Moten, because this is fantastic. And these bits of Moten will end. "Yes, she, Alice Walker, she's definitely attuned to the secret and to the question of the secret, the problem of its marketing, and the racial limits of its comprehension. But her story also, it seems to me, demands that we consider, on the other side of sheer thievery and impossible imitation, someone like Bob Dylan may be listening to the Mississippi Sheiks and Roscoe Holcomb doing very different performances of Sitting on Top of the World. The secret in blues and bluegrass. Both versions of the secret crucial in Bob Dylan's singular forging of his own. In apposition to Walker's formulations, the secret is only transmitted in transformation and transmutation." Then he's asked about Gilberto Gil and Afro-Brazilian samba, and Moten responds, "While attempting to stave off any naive romanticism regarding the salutary effects of racial mixture, it's still necessary to consider the potentially fruitful ways that whiteness is disturbed and blackness reconfigured by Gilberto in his context and Dylan in his. They both contribute to the international of beauty and necessary obscurity. Art is the transmission of the secret, but the secret is transmuted in every moment of its transmission. I think that the transmutation must show up as obscurity, but such obscurity must also be recognizable, and obscurity that people can feel and know." That's the end of the quote from Moten, and there I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louis. Can I have now Karolina Marcinkowska with her presentation?
So I'm not a native speaker in English, so if you want to take the translation, you will be welcome. Dobrze, to ja może zacznę. Ja będę improwizowała tak naprawdę, nie mam żadnego tekstu do przeczytania, czy żadnych konkretnych teorii do postawienia. Raczej to jest to, co Państwu spróbuję tutaj pokrótce przedstawić, to są różnego rodzaju czy performanse, czy wydarzenia,
performances or events that I took
którymi
part
się
in,
interesowałam po prostu,
that
które w
I
pewnym
was
momencie
interested
doszło
in,
tak, poprzez to, że
which
brałam
at
udział w
some
tej
point,
konferencji.
since I'm a
Wydaje mi
participant
się, że
in this
wiele tu jest
conference,
rzeczy, które się splatają,
and I feel
tematów,
there's a
które
lot
się
of
splatają i
things
być może z
that
tego
come
też
together,
coś
that
ciekawego
intertwine,
wyniknie.
and perhaps this might
Zostałam
lead to
zaproszona
interesting
do przedstawienia tego
outcomes.
referatu
I've been asked
w
to
blogu
deliver this
dotyczącym
paper
tożsamości
in
sztuki.
this section on
Więc,
the identity of art.
ciężko mi było nie
So
mówić o
it would
badaniach,
be
które
difficult for
prowadziłam na
me not to
Madagaskarze.
discuss my research in Madagascar.
Działały one 3 lata i dotyczyły kultu, który
3
tak
years
naprawdę w
of
żargonie,
research about a cult
antropologicznym,
that
się
in
kulcie,
anthropology
o kulcie owładnięcia przez
is
przodków, czy kulcie
referred to
zmarłych.
as possession by ancestors.
Tutaj może od razu zaznaczę, że
And let me say that there are a number of topics that will come to light, topics which have a performative aspect, identity, the approach to culture, the way history is interpreted. But listening to these papers, I realized that a curator working with an artist often enters into a similar relationship as that of the anthropologist to the persons studied, because curators tend to distort what artists want to say, and anthropologists are guilty of the same when they study the others, the other. And the similarity here might be greater than we expect, and that's a problem that we run into doing field studies, field research, because we are always in the position of others, of the alien gaze, wanting to understand the language of the people we are studying. But first, let me say a few words about what this Trumba cult is, and how I tried to maybe not so much adopt the perspective of the other. We know that's impossible. We can't flee. We can't go beyond our cultural limitations. We can't stop being ourselves. We can't stop being a scholar. But a few conclusions that I find interesting as regards the way we define performance in contemporary art today. This might sound very bewildering, but bear with me, I hope it'll become clear in time. To begin with, what is Trumba, or how has it been seen or read? There are a number of stories, and the story that becomes predominant, that becomes the official take, is a choice made by a curator or an anthropologist. I had the pleasure of working in Geneva, Switzerland, on a photographic exhibition of Jacques Faublet, a French anthropologist who worked in the region of Madagascar, of northern Madagascar, near the one I visited. This is a 1940s photograph by Faublet, and I have a number of these pairings. This is a photo I took at a similar event, a similar ceremony. So it looks fairly similar, but I think I'll focus on the most important element from an anthropologist's standpoint, the moment of possession itself, the moment the person is taken over by an ancestral spirit. This is a possession cult.
Niepoprawnie tłumaczone po prostu opętania, co tym bardziej jeszcze wprowadza taki właśnie...
And there's a nice distinction in Polish between, but that's relevant. And this was the point in the ceremony that was most observed, described, and defined. And what I found surprising, what astounded me, is that only in few descriptions of the cult, actually dwelt on this moment, the moment the spirit enters into the body of the medium. This is called mianjaka in Malagasy, and it's not the spirit entering, but the spirit settling, taking up residence, taking up abode. And what matters here is the identity, the way the participants of the cult, its worshippers, defined their identity. Each of these spirits has the name of one of the kings of the Sakalawa people, for instance, Andruntindraza or Andramisara, and you can tell them apart only by their clothes, their facial painting. All of this is meaningful. I just wanted to give you examples. So the ritual seeks to reenact the story, but in an artistic way, in an improvised way, and a very subjective way. So it's not a single clear-cut story, but depending on the medium, depending on the chumba, the story will differ. This is the ceremony. It's a meeting of clients with a medium, who is usually female. So it was easier for me to do research on a female cult. I suppose a man would find it difficult to gain access to study this topic. Why do people approach, why do people come to see these chumba mediums? Well, because of life problems. Financial, of the heart, what have you. If someone has a problem, if they have a question, or if they want to understand an event from the past, they can go see a chumba and inquire. Just a couple of photographs to dispel stereotypes, because whenever we talk about cults of spirit possession, people, Europeans mostly, will imagine these very bizarre, exotic rites, while normally they're held in people's apartments in a residential setting. And this is the ceremony. You have a group of people watching TV, paying some attention to a king speaking through the medium, but it's a form of participation as well. And to refer to what Eva said yesterday about exotization, how Europeans imagine everything that's African, even art, even contemporary art, we tend to look for signs of difference, the exotic, while in chumba cults, the medium, the spirit medium, will communicate with the spirit over a cell phone using mobile telephony. So obviously technology is being co-opted by spiritualism or the ritual. The conclusions are fairly simple. It's based on what my interviewees said. They see it in terms of an encounter, not possession, not trance, which had always been defined as natural, a technical, purely technical process. What's relevant here is that an ordinary person can meet a specific ancestral spirit who settles into the Chumba's body. But this is a meeting between life and death, body and soul, individual, community, man, woman, because as I said, most of the mediums are female. Panjaka, the royalty and subjects, and the past and the present. And these are the main points of encounter. And these words I've underlined, underscored, or highlighted, sorry, largely are compatible with the vocabulary of performance. They're looking for identity, and the identity of the Chumba is manifest not only in the costume, but also in the name. The name itself contains a story of this king or queen. It's also a transformation. What we see in the faces of these mediums are signs, on faces are signs cause of death. So if someone's eye is whitened, that means they had problems seeing, and that's why they died. So this transformation is clear, is also can be comprehensible for people who take part. The process, process which is what matters most. It's not about obtaining a result, an outcome, it's about the encounter itself. It's about ordinary people who are not chosen, who aren't chosen by the Spirit. And so these people can encounter the Spirit via the Shumba. It's a process that matters. It's the question of being among others and not getting an answer to any specific question. And then community. We've said a lot about this. As you saw, as I showed you, it's not about asking any specific questions. It's about being with the spirits. The spirits are believed to have power that's handed down from generation to generation. They have a vital force, and spirits are often referred to as air. So they're not defined. It's an air that you breathe, and there are spirits in the air around us, the air that we breathe. And Madagascar, in Malagasy, the name is Tanindrazana, Isle of the Ancestors. And if we want to understand anything about any Malagasy culture, we must realize that in each region the cult takes different forms. My fascination with the culture began with art, and here we're segueing into art. Jean-Jacques Bello is an artist, a non-artist, and in fact, like his father before him, he made alo funerary sculptures that were placed on mass graves, and this stela is full of symbolic significance, the cosmology and mythology of the Malagasy people, but on the top is something that refers directly to the individual interred. Here, Jean-Jacques is, his sculptures look different. And at the pinnacle, at the top, you have all sorts of complex stories about the colonial period, or stories that have to do with the life of the people in the grave, but they can also be very symbols of affluence. In a Malagasy context, this is Zebu, and a woman who has a sewing machine on her head to top it off, so she's definitely affluent, and or you can have a bus with passengers. This is also a sculpture by Jean-Jacques Bello And the reason I'm showing it is that Jean-Jacques had been invited to Magicien de la Terre to participate, and since I met him, from his take on it is a little different. So he didn't treat the invitation as any distinction, because at the moment all he does is sculpture commissioned by Anthropologist, and he can't make a living doing sculpture for local community. People can't afford to buy these sculptures, so currently he's become a contemporary art, involuntarily become a contemporary artist against his will. At least that's how it's put. Besides, these sculptures are too expensive for people to use them according to their original intent, and they no longer mediate between ancestors and people alive today. Their meaning has been distorted or perhaps transformed, changed. Similarly, when talking about cults of the ancestors, cults of the dead, there was mention of, speaking of Magicien de la Terre, you mentioned the painted decorative coffins. I'm sorry, I lost the Polish word here. Yes, that's the Polish word. From Ghana. Ata Oko, to begin with, was his project. He used drawings like this, and this is one of his coffins in a figurative style, as a boat, a vessel. And this tradition of making decorative caskets has been taken up by Samuel Kanekwe, who had also been invited to take part in Magicien de la Terre. The reason I'm saying it is to give you an idea of the context that these artists draw on, and how words, no concept is appropriate, is adequate here. Because if you confine yourself to academic distinctions into tradition, the contemporary anthropology and contemporary art, we lose a lot. It's difficult to make, to put explicitly or to make clear, but I think that if I discuss these case studies, we can come to conclusions. And now the question is, what are these Ghanaian coffins? Is it contemporary art? Because Magicien de la Terre was a show that defined certain objects, that items that had been associated with a certain ethnic group, a cultural tradition. But following the exhibition, the significance, the meaning underwent transformation. Often these coffins channeled the profession of the deceased or the dreams of the deceased, so it didn't necessarily have to directly bear on their profession or the context in which that person existed, but it was a symbol, a sign of something more, like a gift for the deceased. Okay, this is a museum piece. It's a casket, it's a cell phone-shaped casket, but Kanekwe also holds workshops, and as you can see, you have all sorts of people attending from all professions, and they designed their own caskets. So this is an art form that's been turned into a business. by way of these workshops.
I'm
happy that you already discussed Magicien de la Terre, but Canacones coffins were also defined, identified as the art of these magicians. As I see it, the show was another step, another attempt at unnecessarily defining something that can do without any definition, that transcends disciplines. The Chuba cult can't be seen only as a cult of the ancestors or worship of the dead. It can't merely be described using anthropological terms, but it's not performance, it's not art either, even though there are a lot of, they have a lot of points in common. Problems of definition, problems of defining what African art is, were encountered by Yinka Shoni Barre, whom most of you know, I suppose. In an interview, he said that people expected his art to be authentic. And this is a stumbling block. What does authentic mean? Authentic is a concept taken from ethnography. We speak of exhibits which are authentic because they had been used in a specific cultural context, in a specific point in time, and they were put to use, which makes them authentic. So how do we understand authentic when talking about contemporary art? And based on this question, Yinka Shoni Barre began making various, not just sculptures, but also photographs, started using various media to distort a Victorian, maybe, image, but also, as this quote shows, as we see in this quote, he relies on something which people consider typically African, these wax print fabrics, which, as Yinka Shoni Barre has proven, are not African. They come from Indonesian batik printing. They were brought to Africa by the Dutch and then manufactured by the British. Today, one of the major companies in manufactures these in Europe and then exports this fabric to Africa. So something we associate with Africa turns out not to be African at all. And this fabric is used by the artist. He calls himself a hybrid child, a post-colonial hybrid, as he was born in London, then moved to Nigeria. So that's how he sees himself. And I think that this kind of art serves to shatter various stereotypes and proves that we don't need to pigeonhole, define everything, because this comes, we lose a lot, we lose sight of a lot of aspects, be it in terms of anthropology or contemporary art. And there's another artist I wanted to present, Meshach Gaba, all of whose work began with the question, what is African contemporary art? Can it be seen as a distinct art form? He designed 12 different rooms, which he called a Museum of Contemporary African Art, and each of these rooms was a site where viewers could produce something new. So it was interactive, it was a conceptual piece where the viewers could contribute. And I think this quote on the slide speaks volumes about what Goba had to deal with, the expectation that he would come up with a piece of work that would fit into the phantasm that is contemporary African art. The library was a place where you could talk. So this is a reference to what haunted European beliefs to the effect that Africa didn't have a history because it wasn't a written history, it was an oral history. So a library is a place where you can talk, or a meeting place, a canteen. And that part of the art museum here was a canteen as well. Then, and in closing, I wanted to give a brief overview of a Nigerian artist, Jelili Atitko. From an interview, he said that he's unhappy with critics seeing him as a performer, activist, contemporary artist. He operates in Lagos, in a specific neighborhood that he was born in, and he feels that what we call performance art is the best way, the best vehicle to show contemporary problems, to show things that are relevant and topical in a given context. And what's also interesting here, and to turn full circle and get back to Chumba in Madagascar, apart from the fact that his actions, his work, reflects topical issues, he also uses symbols that are derived from a specific context, like the Yoruba culture. We mentioned the Yoruba ethnic group yesterday, and that's a symbolic realm that he draws on, which brings us back to ancestor worship. The Yoruba have a gungun, a powerful symbol, a figure actually, who is disguised, who wears the attributes of a spirit of the dead, and they restore social order, communicating important messages or meaning. So Jelili doesn't want to confine himself, doesn't want to be limited only to the realm of art or any other. I also liked this quote from Susan Sontag, who says that art is a general condition of the past present in the present. Becoming part of the past is to become a work of art, says Susan Sontag, and this is very much in line with Chumba cult, which is a reenactment, a performative reenactment of the past in the here and now, reenactment of something that's not been written down in books, but which is reinterpreted and reconstructed live by way of performances by mediums, by people that the ancestors designate. So a medium is not a profession, it's and now to summarize, ritual and performance. It's not about comparing the two, these two. It's about pointing out that sometimes they're born of the same need, the need to find an identity. They have to do with transition from state to state, a transformation. often it's a process that's not about outcomes or result, but as an end in itself. It's unpredictable, improvised, it depends on, it's related to a cultural, historical, and social context. Additionally, the actions, even the presence of an individual in Chumba, this spirit medium, serves to create a community. Even when clients aren't actively involved in the ceremony, a community does emerge. It's rooted in the here and now, it's based in the here and now. And as for beliefs and artifacts, just as the alo alo sculptures or the coffins from Ghana, we see that death is seen as a vital force, as a power for life, as something that brings about change, and as a process. And I would say, and something, actually it doesn't require, it doesn't demand a definition, neither ritual nor performance. The participants surely aren't looking for labels, don't want these things to be pigeonholed. And just to take advantage of the opportunity, I want to plug my book, where perhaps I've managed to express certain things more coherently than I did at this presentation.
And I will pass the microphone to Przemysław, Dr. Przemysław Strożek, and his presentation titled Journal of Revolution, Souffle, 1966-1971, An Artistic Left in Morocco. The floor is yours.
Nie wiem, w jakim języku mam mówić chyba. Okay, I will speak in English. Thank you, Konrad, for invitation, and I am very happy to be a part of this conference. My approach, it will be a bit different than Karolina's approach, because, like, in my opinion, in science, like, everything needs to be defined, and in this context, I also would like to define some questions around the African magazines, and especially avant-garde magazines in the global setting. So the title of my lecture is A Magazine of Revolution, Souffle and Artistic Left in Morocco. And I would like to situate the magazine in the global and historical perspective in the research on the modernist magazines. I will read it, so it will be easier and maybe much more understandable. In the last years, there has been an increased interest in the history of avant-garde groups in Maghreb. The 6th edition of the Marrakesh Biennale, not new now, from February until May 2016, which intended to map out relations between cultural resistances from different geographies, featured a separate section on the works by Farid Balakia, Mohamed Sheba, and Mohamed Melehi, made in the 1960s and 1970s. This section also included archival issues of Souffle, an avant-garde magazine that was a mouthpiece of their experiments, as well as a platform for political struggle. The inclusion of Souffle in the Biennale, organized under the patronage of King Mohammed VI, can be seen as a symbolic gesture of reinstating the position of left-wing art in the shaping of contemporary Moroccan culture. Although the periodical was shut down in 1971 due to the communist propaganda, the magazine is treated today as an important historical testimony of the ideas of cultural renewal. After all, it was the mouthpiece of the first avant-garde group active in Morocco that presented new ideas for literature, art, film, and theater. In recent years, Souffle has been digitized, making access to its content easy for everyone, and a few significant studies of the journal have appeared. including Kansas Fruis, 2013 monograph La Revue Souffle, and a 2016 selection of English translations of the journal's content, Souffle en face, a critical anthology from the Moroccan Journal of Politics. A chapter discussing Souffle by Claire Davis has been included in After Year Zero catalogue, and Andy Stafford wrote on Souffle in 2013 in a volume La Revue, the 20th Century Periodical in French. In the light of all these recent publications, it can be said that Souffle is regarded now as a key literary, artistic, and political periodical of the 20th century. In my paper, I decided to locate Souffle on the transnational and transcontinental global world map and in the historical context of the various avant-garde magazines, as well as politically engaged artistic journals emerging in 1960s and 1970s. By taking this wider perspective, I intend to demonstrate that the universal mechanisms at play in the formation of radical avant-garde groups. Why was the foundation of a periodical serving as a group's mouthpiece such an instrumental part of this process? How situate Souffle on the global and historical spectrum of revolutionary left-wing artistic and literary publications? Finally, I would like to answer the question, how can new research perspectives in the studies of modernist magazines change the way in the studying of particular artistic and literary groups in the global setting? So I would like to start to talk a little bit about the role of magazines in modernist and cultural studies. Synthetical studies on the role of journals, magazines are still a rarity. In this context, it is worth noting the importance of the 3 volumes of the Oxford Critical and Cultural History of Modernist Magazines, published between 2009 and 2013. Essays included in these volumes presented hundreds of periodicals from the Euro-Atlantic area up to 1960s and the formation of various artistic groups from the perspective of so-called sociology of modernisms. The authors paid special attention to emergence of various artistic groups, people sharing interests, friends manifesting their ideas through jointly organized activities. They followed Alain Badiou's thought, I quote, "Avant-garde means group, a group that publishes and acts and which is motivated by strong personalities." End of quote. In reality, avant-garde groups came to life, declined and ceased through the little magazines that gave them a platform. When we look at the avant-garde magazines appearing in large numbers in 1920s, they served in general as platforms for the vanguardisms, directing attention to other groups, initiatives, and publications. They were a gathering point, an exchange place for programs and discussions, public debates and confrontations with readers, as well as a site for collective efforts and political activism. Radical left-wing magazines attempted to create a transnational network, an international platform for progressive ideas, and a common united front for fighting imperialism and the bourgeois. As time passed, all these left-wing publications became radicalized, and while their first issues engaged the ideas of renewal of art and literature, they soon turned towards a more political profile, engaging in a global project of avant-garde renewal and communist propaganda. For example, the 10th issue of Warsaw-based Block magazine presented a global, even transcontinental reach of the network of contacts based in Latin America, North America, as well as in Asia. You can see like the points of where is São Paulo or Beijing or Japan, so the places where the magazine has been shipped in 1920s. The Oxford project on the history of cultural magazines, which can serve as a great foundation for the future scholarship of artistic periodicals, did not, however, take into account journals from beyond Europe and the US. The comprehensive study on African, Latin American, or Asian modernist magazines is still missing. It is worth to mention that up until 1940, avant-garde journals were published in Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, in Japan, while Don Quixote and At Tatavur by the surrealist Egyptian group came out in Cairo, self-dubbed the first avant-garde literary and artistic review in the Arabic language. I wanted only to comment that in 3 days there will be a great opening of the exhibition related to this magazine and to the surrealism in Egypt at the Centre Centre Pompidou in France. So current scholarship of this kinds of publication lacks not only a global perspective, but also a more synthetical approach in the study of magazines addressing the question of negritude. For example, La Dépêche Africaine, Présence Africaine, Martinican Tropique, or Nigerian Black Orpheus. All these magazines have had an influence on shaping the modernist way of thinking in the global perspective and should be included in the scholarship on modernism. A project on modernist magazines after 1944 was initiated by contributors to After Year Zero catalog, who investigated some magazines to shine spotlight on collaboration at various times and in different places within the African continent or the African diaspora. But it is still like a rarity to study the magazines in global perspective. So, where I was there? Here. With this in mind, everything what I said in the introduction, it is worth to take a closer look at Souffle. Altaf, it was first published in the 1960s and 1970s in a special geopolitical context. It employed strategies very similar to those of other magazines. It was at once a mouthpiece for the literary and artistic avant-garde and a platform for international cooperation in the name of revolutionary ideas. Established in 1966, a decade after Morocco regained its independence, the first series ran until 1971. Under a different title, Anfas, it then had 7 issues published in Arabic. Over the years, 22 issues of Souffle came out, and its character clearly evolved. While the first issues were focusing on literary renewal, later issues were a platform for a more radical political proposals, namely making contacts with tricontinental organizations on the side of revolutionary movements in the Palestine, in Portuguese colonies, freedom movements in West Sahara, or on the side of politicians, groups such as Black Panthers. Souffle brought together avant-garde writers, artists, and politicians, had plenty of international connections, and its subtitle, Revue Culturelle Arabe du Maghreb, focused on the entire region, rather than just Morocco. Its associates were invested in the idea of cultural decolonization, that means leaving behind any French legacy in order to create new artistic forms in dialogue with the decolonized world. The initiator and the editor-in-chief for the entire run of Souffle was Abdelatif Labi. His collaborators included Abraham Serfati, the filmmaker Ahmed Bounani, the writer Mohamed Berrada, as well as artists Farid Balakia, Mohamed Melehi, and Mohamed Shaba, to which I talked in the introduction. In the first years, Labi was concentrated on creating foundations for a new literature of Maghreb in favor of the national language Arabic. The first issue ran a manifesto addressing writers and poets, urging them to unite in the name of a cultural change. In this sense, Labi took up the ideas of engaged literature, with poetry seen as a revolutionary force. In his understanding, the new Moroccan literature was meant to break with its colonial past, with his journal, a new platform for international debate and cooperation. I quote, "What is most important is that the one-way communication of past work is abolished. The era of managers and masters of thought is finished. We can no longer tolerate limitations due to favoritism or territorial taboos. Something is about to happen in Africa and in the rest of the third world. If the journal finds its public, as we are hoping it will, as long as resources are available, it will become a flashpoint for debates on issues in our culture. Our Maghrebi, African, European, and other writer friends are fraternally invited to participate in our modest enterprise. Their text will be welcome." In issue 2, Labi wrote, Souffles was conceived in the beginning as a tool or organ, permitting all those who had something to say in the field of literature and culture to express themselves in total liberty. The letters and essays we received and the context we established in response confirmed that our intentions were not misjudged. The editorial board has already attracted new friends in Maghreb, Africa, and abroad. In this way, the editor of Souffle welcomed authors from beyond Morocco, aiming for international distribution of the journal. Issue 1011, dedicated to Maghreb's literature, demonstrated a wide network of contacts with writers from across the region, from Tunisia, from Algeria, as well as writers from afar, including Syrian poet Adonis and the publisher of Beirut's Mavakif, poets and activists Mario de Andrade from Angola and Haitian René de Pestre, also frequently published in the journal. Visual artists played an equally important part in the task of initiating cultural decolonization. The entire issue, 7-8, entitled Situation Arts Plastique Maroc, focused on visual arts. In an essay, Moroccan Painting Today, we read, I quote, "Two basic issues arose as painters sought to promote modern art through their works and ideas. That of avant-garde, the present in relation to the future and the demands of contemporary life, and that of tradition, the present in relation to the past and the traditional values of the visual arts." End of quote. It is worth to mention that Moroccan artists grouped around Souffle were consciously referring to the ideas of the avant-garde, linking them to folk culture, and seeing abstraction and op art to have revolutionary overtones. In various statements published in Souffle, the artists themselves wanted to marry Arabic heritage with new trends in art. Sheba wrote that the source of his inspiration was not only the work of the Berbers, but also Kandinsky, Picasso, and Guttuso Fontana. Melehi in turn stressed the importance of his stay in the United States and the discovery of action painting. Moroccan painters proved to be well versed in contemporary trends, which were defined in the same issue. It's interesting how they defined, for example, functionalism, op art, or socialist realism. For example, in the definition of socialist realism for Moroccan painters, they include Fernand Léger and Renato Guttuso, like Western artists, rather than the artists from behind the Iron Curtain, like from Poland or from Eastern Europe. So I thought it was very interesting. So, undoubtedly, the Moroccan artists' knowledge of contemporary trends in art was rather Occidental. Starting from the questions of literary renewal, Souffle has evolved to be the chief outlet of an avant-garde group, bringing together poets, painters, filmmakers, and theater workers. Its aim was to have a significant influence on the entirety of innovative movements in the Maghreb. In this context, those working for Souffle made a clear break with traditional understanding of the concept of negritude and the present African environment, which was responsible for the 1966 Dakar Festival. Abdallah Stouki, writing in the second issue of the journal, attacked the organizers for not inviting representatives from countries such as Cuba or Guyana. He argued for a redefinition of the concept of negritude, so that it would fit the new geopolitical landscape. I quote, "The problems of blacks in Mozambique are radically different from those of blacks in Los Angeles, who themselves do not have problems in common with the Senegalese and Kenyans. And all this is true because the Negro no longer exists. The Negro has disappeared and the African has come into existence. The African, a product of unique socio-historical circumstances, must face up to the same sorts of economic and cultural problems as the Cubans and Koreans. We should not forget that questions of race are but a superstructure, a mantle, and obscure ideological emanation concealing an economic reality." End of quotation. End of quotation. Stuckey pointed out that the concept of negritude, initially defined in the 1930s and developed throughout the 1940s, should become a subject of a radical critique in order to move away from African race struggle towards a transcontinental class struggle. Because of this, the radical critique of the Dakar Festival coincided with the affirmation of Cultural Congress in Havana. The latter saw the tricontinental idea being popularized, promoting socialism, communism, and rebellion movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. One of the main points of the Havana Appeal declared, I quote, "The Eurocentrist view of the world has entered a state of crisis in the last decade. Asia, Latin America, and Africa, in one way or another, have begun to shape the history of the world." End of quote. While no one from Souffle took part in the Havana conference, the journal republished in its ninth issue the conference papers delivered by Angolan representative Mario de Andrade and a Haitian writer René de Pestre, who in public talk also criticized negritude concept. I quote, "Today black bourgeoisies wield their power through neocolonial intrigues and violence in Africa and the Americas, and seize the concept of negritude as their ideological weapon. Negritude is used as a myth that obfuscates the existence of the black bourgeois, who in Haiti, as in numerous African countries, formed a dominant class. Today, for both black and white mystifiers, negritude implies the absurd idea that the black man is endowed with a particular human nature. It has become a way of leading black people away from their duty to make revolution." End of quote. It is worth to mention that Souffle listed the past radical Cuban journal Casa de las Americas and served as a platform for mutual cooperation between Morocco and Cuba. Souffle, Casa de las Americas, together with Africasia and Mavakif, were meant to become a platform for international exchange and propaganda for new decolonized culture and revolutionary movements across the three continents. These contacts and exchanges between the magazines clearly prove that they become a sort of a gathering point, a place for sharing programs and discussions, as well as sites for collective efforts. This platform, a transcontinental network, was soon joined by publications from Rome and Brussels, Palestina and Solidarité Palestine, aiming to propagate revolutionary movements in the Palestine. Soon, the ideas of avant-garde literature and art fell by the wayside, and Souffle became radically involved, first in the tricontinental provisions, and later in a strong pan-Arabic propaganda, including voicing their support for Palestine, following its defeat in the 1967 Six-Day War with Israel. In Transcolonial Maghreb, Imagining Palestine in the Era of Decolonization, Olivia Harrison claimed that as its radicalization progressed, the journal became, I quote, "the epitome of transcolonial identification with the Palestine." End of quotation. The entire 15th issue of Souffle, with the subheading "For the Palestinian Revolution," was dedicated to this notion. Not only Labi and other writers, but also visual artists associated with Souffle have quickly become radicalized. Melehi's work has evolved into something I would term as political op art. One testimony of this is this graphic work, Palestine, a clear demonstration of Maghreb's support for the Palestinian Revolution and promotion of liberation movements. The later numbers included, for example, photos from the Pan-African Congress in Algeria, Revolutionary Black Panthers posters, or the famous Angola Day of Solidarity poster reprinted to Souffle from Tricontinental magazine. This more general politicization in 1970 and 1971 led to a split within the group. The aesthetic wing of Souffle set up their own journal, the distinctly cultural and non-political called Integral. At the time, the penultimate issue of Souffle was a special issue on education. It used not only Cuba, but also China and even Albania as models. The final issue of Souffle pledged the journal continued support for Le Combat Africain et Tricontinental, but aimed to concentrate on the Maghreb and the Arab world instead. Eventually, the journal closed down in 1972. Labi and Serfati were jailed. The avant-garde group associated with Souffle ceased to exist completely. And now the conclusions. In my opinion, the sources of Souffle's strategy and actions are rooted in the historical avant-garde. Although it appeared in another geopolitical context, we can see similar schema at play in Labi's journal. A group is motivated by a single strong personality. The magazine brings together politically engaged writers and artists, prints manifestos, appeals, publishes texts of friendly editors from other magazines, such as Andrade or De Pestre, engages in debates and establishes international contacts to become a transnational platform for exchange. Initially, advocating ideas of cultural renewal, the journal eventually radicalizes and engages in a strictly political agitation. When it comes to socio-political matters, Souffle completely breaks off from publications, magazines, shaping the phenomenon of negritude, such as Tropique or Presence Africaine, in order to build a common transcontinental front of cooperation with other avant-garde and left-wing magazines from Latin America, like Casa de las Americas, for example. Finally, in the name of propaganda for revolutionary movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, it enters international circulation, creating a platform of exchange with journals such as Casa de las Americas, Africa, Asia, as well as Pro-Palestinian Palestina and Solidarité Palestine. I wanted to show also a list of contacts of Polish magazine Blok, which also promoted other magazines like, for example, Souffle in 1971. From a global and historical perspective, Souffle still proves that it is the publishing organ of avant-garde group, the magazine that wields a great power of influencing cultural and political change. Therefore, in order to understand the innovative cultural changes in the global world and to recognize the formation of the transcontinental political and artistic groups, it is crucial to direct our scholarly efforts towards magazines from beyond the Euro-Atlantic field. It is worth to continue the project begun by Oxford's critical history of modernist magazines and after year zero project, and broaden the scope of research to include magazines from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. In my view, there is a need for a more inclusive consideration of the problem of avant-garde magazines in the historical and global perspective. This paper, taking Souffle as a case study, is in fact attempting this very approach. Thank you very much.
Can I have Karolina and Louis to join Przemek? And if you could open, and we would like to open the discussion regarding those three themes and presentations which we heard just in a few minutes ago. Thank you very much once again for those presentations. As we all see, all subjects are quite vast and from different approaches, but I guess that we have this notion that what I call the new identity of art has historical background, but it has also influences from anthropology, faith or beliefs, and ethnic perspective, as well as philosophical and literature. but I would like to start from these collages of your works, Louis, and how you can find it, because you underline a few times that you base on a quote on a particular book, but I guess that this is the new approach in a sense for the artistic practice. And can you develop as well a bit more about the Sea of the History, the film which you have as well some fragments of it? What was the approach for that particular project? Yeah, here. Should be fine. No, so take it this way.
Oh yeah, there we go. What the approach for the project in relationship to collage? Do you mean as well?
Yeah. And this film, Sea of History.
The Sea is History. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, there was a film that I just finished recently, which I was actually going to show a clip from, but I didn't have time. I thought it was a bit greedy to take up more space because I'd already had about 35 minutes, I think. But yeah, The Sea is History is a film that I made in the Dominican Republic and Haiti just recently. I was there for 3 months doing a residency, and I went to the residency without any particular preconceived ideas about what I would be doing, apart from I had read some books and some different pieces of information that had led me towards thinking certain lines of thought, notably to do with, on the one hand, the idea that the colonization, well, the arrival of Columbus in the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, is the first place he decided to settle down and begin a colony in the Americas, was kind of the beginning of what we could call the plantationocene, which is a term that has come out recently from an American theorist called Donna Haraway. Well, it's not just her. Donna Haraway and a few other people have spoken about that, which is another way of naming the Anthropocene, our current geological epoch. So I was interested to see the connections between the colonization beginning in the Americas and the relationship it has to climate change and global warming today, and then also the role that the transatlantic slave trade has had in that as the sort of marking point for a modern period. So I made this film, The Sea is History, which is actually just a sort of redoing of the poem by Derek Walcott, who's a famous Caribbean poet from St. Lucia. And for me, yeah, I suppose why I approached the poem by Derek Walcott was an interest also the way in which he treats history as something. For him, this poem, The Sea is History, is a sort of criticism of the European monumentalization of history, and how in the Caribbean particularly, let's take again this example of Christopher Columbus. The history of Columbus arriving in the Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic, is very much concretized, quite literally, through statues, and they still celebrate this within the present as some important part of the sort of construction of their identity as Dominicans. But you know, what's hidden behind that is the absolute violence of that whole project. And so instead, if we take Walcott's proposition that history is something that's alive and living, someone says to Walcott in 1977, "What is history for you?" And Walcott says, well, history, it could be that tree, it could be that river, it can be the wind. The sea is history. So he proposes that history is something actually that's ever present and ever alive, and that's not actually fixed within documents and books and letters and statues. And in that sense, you know, it offers up the possibility for history to be rewritten as a form of counter-narrative against sort of established political discourses that get historicized. Anyway, and then just to relate that to collage as a practice, well, for me, that's what collage does as well. Collage, for me, I mean, is a way of understanding the potentials of animism within an art practice perhaps too, because you're quite literally dealing with pieces of apparently inanimate or dead material, but you bring them to life again by placing them in a different sort of milieu and context. I mean, I just wrote a text recently that will be published soon about collaging as a form of compost making. And I'm very interested in compost as a material substance, because compost is quite literally dead beings that get mulched together, but in the death that they make, they actually generate life. Yeah. So again, that relates to this conception of history that Walcott has. I think that, you know, the history is something actually still very much living and alive, and it can be ripped apart and changed and rethought and reimagined against the sort of, you know, violence of kind of historicizing things.
But in your films, and that will be related to what Karolina said regarding the rituals and the rituals performance, and this notion of now and here and now. So the very like present condition. And you said about collage, and the collage is as well connected with the avant-garde and political engage, is a radical gesture, artistic in terms of literature and as well visual culture and visual arts. But yes, I would like to back for a moment to this to your presentation and ask a question: what if there is it could be the rituals which you told us, that it could be a definition, for example, for the post-performance, which is kind of new definition and is still to understand, because I think it's what we will like to elaborate in the CCA in the next year, the idea of post-performance. So maybe that's the way to find a definition for this, or understanding of this particular term.
So maybe if you will find it helpful, maybe it could be another theory that you'll find out, and that it can somehow show you traces to follow. I think this will be the way for sure for the Malagasy people, because they always look for something that will be in the future. They look for it in the past. So actually they recreate the past to look for other dimensions or solutions or whatever. So maybe this is also a kind of solution for us, so for the artists. Even.
Compost, it's collage as compost, like, you know, to bring the past to the present and change it. And so the things happen in a sense what Przemysław just presented, that 20s, 30s avant-garde was like a keystone for radical gestures, but as well it was a projectile future of radicalism of the 60s and 70s. So if I would like to ask you a question, how you will combine together the idea of magazines as a platform in the nowadays. It could be a interesting lesson or interesting inspiration for transmedium communication via social medias and global access to the network.
Yes, of course, the internet replaced this idea of contacts and of the networks, because like everything we have in internet right now, artists can communicate through internet. Like in 1920s, 1960s, 1970s, it was not possible. So I found very interesting like the idea of making research on particular avant-garde group. Like when we look at avant-garde groups, not as we look at movements, like every avant-garde group had its own magazine and wanted to connect with other avant-garde groups. It was the same in 1920s, 1930s, as well as 1940s, 50s, 60s. I think up to the internet. I'm not so much more familiar with the arts of 1980s and how artists communicate that time. But what we see in the case study of Souffle is this kind of, and also magazine is very important to show art beyond the museum. Like, for example, in one country it is not possible to exhibit for communist artists their works, so they circulate their works through the magazines, you know, and it's like beyond the official and government's purposes, or something like that. So this is also one of the things why left-wing magazines and avant-garde magazines were so important, because, like, for example, not every time for example, Polish constructivists could exhibit after 1926, after Piłsudski came into power. But anyway, it wasn't so easy as before. Like, I mean, the radical artists. Yeah, coming back to your question, how we can see this sort of activity now? Yeah, I think like internet replaced this idea of communication and also global communication. The case of Souffle is so amazing, in my opinion, because it connected like 3 continents. You know, they were not so much interested into negritude, like they criticized it, and into established connections with, for example, Presence African, which was the establishment magazine that time. They were much more interested into established contacts with political revolutionary movements and cultural avant-garde groups as Casa de las Americas, for example, in Cuba. So this was much more important than like African scope. Yeah?
Are there any questions from the floor, comments, or you would like to share the thoughts with participants?
In 1956, Souffle écoute plus souvent les choses que les êtres, entend la voix de l'eau, c'est le souffle des ancêtres. Ceux qui sont morts ne sont pas morts, ils sont dans l'eau qui coule, ils sont dans le fleuve, ils sont dans le vagin, souffle des ancêtres. 1956, 1958, Aline Diop, Présence africaine, organise à la demande de Senghor le congrès de Rome 58, 59, deuxième congrès de Rome, ensuite Dakar, festival 66. Souffle numéro 1 au Maroc, c'est 66. À la Havane, c'est 66. Dakar Festival, c'est 66. Mais l'intelligentsia africaine a d'abord créé la revue Présence africaine avant les indépendances en 1956 par Aline Diop.
Nie wiem, czy ja mam to przetłumaczyć, czy ktoś... To był cały cytat z Souffle, z pierwszego numeru
That was a quote from the first issue of Souffle. That from 6...
A z kolei w 56 w Dakarze rzekła KWDP, że my sobie ją
Souffle was a poem. Was the title of a poem written in 1956. Listen to things more than you do to beings.
Souffle słucha bardziej rzeczy, rzeczy, a nie ludzi.
Entend la voix de l'eau.
Hear the voice of the water.
C'est le souffle des ancêtres.
Because it is the breath of your ancestors.
Ceux qui sont morts ne sont pas morts.
Those who are dead are not dead, have not died. They are in the flowing water. They are in the flame. And that was a poem by from 1956. And the publication, the review, 1956, Présence africaine, came out in 1956. Journal. Alioune Diop.
Tak, znaczy generalnie chodzi o to, że w 56 ten wiersz został stworzony przez
Aimé Césaire. That's him. That's the author, and it was published in Présence africaine.
Organisé le premier congrès des artistes et écrivains de Rome en 58 d'abord et en 59 deuxièmement, avant que Senghor ne décide, après les indépendances du Sénégal, à organiser le premier festival mondial des arts en 66. Et ça vient de Paris.
Czyli właściwie chodzi o to, że już w 56
So already as early as 1956, this group of African intellectuals living in Paris founded Présence africaine, while the first Congress in Rome was held 2 years later. So these ideas, even before Souffle was established, these ideas had currency.
Merci beaucoup for sharing that sense of knowledge. If there's any other questions, comments, I would like to thank you all the participants for your time and that you shared with us your thoughts and worked and present a very fascinating subject. And as a last thing which I would like to underline is that at 5:30 we start exhibition tour and presentation of Christian Schurbuka and Zorka Wolny project, 7 miniatures on El Hadji Sy. It's a sound art project which will take place, which took place during the exhibition, and it will be presented at 5:30. So you are more than welcome to join the guide tour for this project. Thank you very much once again for your time. Thank you and goodbye.